What if I told you the way we talk about the housing crisis in Canada is wrong?
Price for a rental unit in Canada hit a record high.
Rising rates for rent across this country.
There were fewer homes listed on New Year's Day than at any other time on record.
This current housing crisis shouldn't have come as a surprise.
We all know this, right? At this point, we've all heard it countless times. We've all read or watched explainers to understand why. So I want you to think to yourself, what is, in your opinion, the problem with housing in Canada? You might come up with a few ideas such as the popular
NIMBY, not in my backyard,
where people don't want to see their neighborhoods change and so they block proposals. Or maybe you came up with restrictive zoning laws. How about the low interest rates which endured from 2008 until just recently, allowing for cheap borrowing? And who can forget sky-high population growth from immigration thrown on top of low supply, along with international students and temporary foreign workers? And there's lots more. Because at the end of the day,
we need to increase the supply of housing.
So here's the thing. All of those are correct to some extent. All of these can explain why supply is limited and demand is high. And that's just it. So here's what I really want to talk about. Not another explainer about why supply is limited or going on endlessly about what the solutions could be. I want to ask, why aren't we implementing the solutions? Or at least why is it taking so long? What do I mean by that? I'll give you some examples. The Liberal Party of Canada, which is the current party forming government at the federal level for you non-Canadians, of which the current leader is our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, in September of 2023 announced the introduction of a tax rebate for rental-purposed housing. I won't comment on whether this will work or not, but I will point out that this was actually in their 2015 platform, then abandoned in 2017, only to be brought back today. Then there was the ban on foreign home buyers, despite that most experts concluded this is an essentially negligible amount of demand and incurs the risk of scaring away future foreign investment if it sets a precedent for this type of behavior. And in Ontario, the current Premier Doug Ford is failing to even meet his own housing targets. And there's so many other examples exactly like these. So to start unpacking the actual problem, we have to look at housing from a slightly different angle. The often touted narrative is that in the past housing was affordable. Our parents, our grandparents could afford housing, and today that's changed. And if you look at this graph here, that looks right. But let's zoom out a little bit. Today looks a bit more like a bubble among other bubbles. Housing is a market and has experienced affordability crises in the early 90s, the early 80s, and that was just what the Bank of Canada data for. You can find articles from the 60s, the 50s, as far back as the 1910s, all lamenting housing affordability crises. And when viewed through this lens, it seems like the problem is far more structural than any specific reason normally given. And yet, homeownership has also risen fairly steadily. If we look at this graph, the percentage of Canadians owning a home, or rather living in an owner-occupied home as the statistic is measured, a majority of Canadians were renters up until the 1950s. Then owning became the majority position, and that's continued to today, where the highest level of home ownership was actually reached around 2011. And now, homeownership has fallen since then as we've entered this recent bubble. This points to one of the reasons that we don't solve the problem with housing. If a majority of Canadians, or even a significant minority of Canadians, are in families that own their home, and they view their home as a retirement scheme, this means a lot of Canadians are interested in seeing the price of homes increase. This gets even worse when you realize that zoning laws, building approvals, are municipal jurisdiction, which has terrible voter turnout across Canada, averaging 40% in Ontario and just 30% in British Columbia, the two most expensive provinces for home prices. And those voters that are turning out are disproportionately homeowners. In other words, we've created a class of homeowners and one of renters. And one of those groups is far more likely to turn out to vote at all levels of government. And this ensures the status quo is kept, which means that any large increases to housing supply or affordable housing are rarely acted on. The other reason housing doesn't get solved is more subtle. Now that we're in a new bubble, Canadians do seem to want the current housing crisis solved. It's become one of the top issues for Canadians in the last year. But there's no consensus on it because all solutions require trade-offs. More sprawl means less farmland and possibly encroaching on other towns and jurisdictions, More density means radically changing neighborhoods and shifting the idea away from a majority of Canadians owning single-family homes. And less immigration doesn't solve the already existing housing crunch, and it shifts future problems away from housing, but into dealing with an aging society where there are fewer workers to support a larger elderly population. And all of this makes it really easy for politicians to endlessly shift blame. Federal politicians on the municipalities and provinces, municipalities on the provinces and the federal government. You get the idea. Nobody wants to take responsibility for something that might anger a large percentage of the electorate. This also leads to a coordination problem, where different policies appear at different levels of government. Municipalities end up elected to keep cities the way they are, while federal governments end up elected with immigration targets that don't match the current housing supply. And despite a lot of the focus on Canada, we aren't alone in this. Much of the Western world is facing high costs relative to income. Canada does appear near the top of this list, though. The only way to really solve the housing crisis is to hold elected officials accountable at all levels of government. Thanks so much for watching to the end. If you're curious to hear more about problems the Canadian economy is facing, I've got a video lined up for you right here.